They said she was too small to be a real threat. Staff Sergeant Cade Brennan announced it loud enough for the whole training pit to hear his voice carrying across the red Georgia clay like a challenge written in the air itself. The December sun beat down on Fort Moore's combatives' ring, turning the afternoon thick and oppressive, and 73 soldiers sat in the weathered bleachers with crossed arms and expressions that said they'd already made up their minds about what they were seeing. Lieutenant Commander Sienna Vaughn stood motionless in the center of the 20-foot square, her Army combat uniform already dark with sweat. She was 28 years old, 5'4", 138 pounds of compact muscle built like a distance runner rather than a brawler. Her dark auburn hair was pulled into a tight regulation bun, revealing a lean face marked by sharp cheekbones and a thin scar that cut through her left eyebrow. The scar was from Yemen. Most of her important memories were. 3 male soldiers circled her like wolves who'd cornered something they didn't understand. Staff Sergeant Cade Brennan stood 6'3", 235 pounds, with the build of someone who'd spent his entire adult life in the gym. His Ranger tab gleamed on his left shoulder. Sergeant Colton Drake moved beside him, shorter but thicker, the kind of man who followed stronger personalities because it was easier than thinking for himself. Specialist Wyatt Reeves completed the circle, 23 years old, lean and wary, still new enough to the Army that he thought aggression was the same as competence. Brennan kept talking, playing to the crowd. Navy sent us a SEAL, more like a diversity SEAL. He emphasized the word, made it sound like an insult. Let's see if she remembers she's a combat master, or if that was just paperwork to check a box. Sienna's right hand moved almost unconsciously to her shoulder, touching the faded trident scar through the thin fabric of her PT shirt. The mark was the size of a silver dollar raised tissue in the shape of the SEAL trident, and it told a story none of these soldiers would believe, even if she told them, which she wouldn't. Command Sergeant Major Augustus Thorne stood at the ring's edge, whistle around his neck, jaw working a piece of gum with the mechanical precision of a man who'd been doing this job for 40 years. He was 63 years old, 8 months from retirement, and he looked deeply uncomfortable with the whole situation. His eyes kept moving from Brennan to Sienna to the gathered crowd, calculating risks, weighing consequences. What none of them knew was that 200 meters away in an office overlooking the training complex, Vice Admiral Marshall Blackstone stood at a window with binoculars pressed to his eyes. The retired 3-star officer was 68 years old, a living legend in the SEAL community, and he'd driven 4 hours from Virginia Beach based on a single phone call from an old friend. He watched the scene below with the expression of a man who'd seen exactly what he expected to see and was now deciding what to do about it. But that comes later. The afternoon heat shimmered off the tin roofs of the training buildings, and the smell of pine sap mixed with sweat and red clay dust created that particular perfume of military installations in the Deep South. Sienna stood perfectly still in the center of the ring, her breathing slow and controlled her weight, balanced and centered. She wasn't looking at Brennan. She was looking through him, past him, at something only she could see. In her mind, she was 21 years old again, standing in the surf zone at Coronado, California, with ice water crashing over her head and an instructor screaming that she was too small, too weak, that she should quit right now before the ocean killed her. She was remembering what it felt like to refuse that voice, to find something deeper than pain or exhaustion or fear. She was remembering what it meant to be a SEAL. Sienna's lips moved barely a whisper, words too quiet for anyone but herself to hear. Remember, I'm a SEAL combat master. They're about to learn what that means. Command Sergeant Major Thorne raised his whistle to his lips. The metallic glint caught the afternoon sun. The crowd leaned forward. Brennan shifted his weight, preparing to attack. The whistle blew. 3 men moved as one, rushing forward with coordinated aggression. And then everything stopped. 96 hours earlier, the commercial bus pulled up to Fort Moore's main gate at 14:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, its air brakes hissing like a tired animal. Sienna Vaughn was the only passenger who stepped off a single rucksack slung over her left shoulder, moving with an economy of motion that some people mistook for hesitation. It wasn't hesitation, it was the careful stillness of someone who'd learned that wasted movement could cost lives. The gate guard checked her military ID, compared the photo to her face, and waved her through without comment. His eyes lingered on her for just a moment, the way eyes always did when they saw the thin ribbon rack on her uniform. Silver Star, 2 bronze stars with V device for valor. Purple Heart, Navy Cross recommendation that had been quietly downgraded due to classification concerns. Not bad for someone who looked like she should be teaching elementary school instead of advanced hand-to-hand combat. The walk to the administrative building took 15 minutes. Sienna didn't rush. She'd learned a long time ago that rushing was how you miss things, small details, that could mean the difference between mission success and body bags. The late September heat pressed down like a physical weight, but she barely noticed. Heat was relative. Heat was nothing compared to Kandahar in August, or Mosul in July, or the inside of a wrecked vehicle in Yemen, with your legs shattered and your best friend bleeding out beside you. Command Sergeant Major Augustus Thorne was waiting in his office when she arrived. The nameplate on his desk was worn smooth from years of handling, and the photos on the wall showed a younger version of himself standing in front of helicopters and armored vehicles in a dozen different countries. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. The modern American military's greatest hits collection. Captain Vaughn. He stood when she entered, offered his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, the handshake of a man who had nothing to prove. Welcome to Fort Moore. Have a seat. Sienna sat. The chair was government-issued, deliberately uncomfortable, designed to keep meetings short. Thorne settled back behind his desk and opened a manila folder that she recognized as her service record. The folder was surprisingly thin for 8 years of military service. Most of the important parts had been redacted. Navy SEAL boy, Thorne said, reading from the file. Basic underwater demolition/SEAL training at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. Only woman in Bud's Class 352 to complete Hell Week. He looked up, his eyes sharp. That's no small thing, Captain. No, Master Chief, it's not. Combat deployments. He turned a page. Afghanistan 2018, Iraq 2019 through 20, Syria 2020 through 21, Yemen 2021 through 22. Another page turn. And then we have 14 months marked Classified Special Activities Division. He looked up again. Want to tell me what that was about? Sienna smiled politely. It was a smile she'd practiced 1,000 times, the smile that gave nothing away. Master Chief, if I could tell you, it wouldn't be classified. Thorne studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. He closed the folder. Medically retired September 2022. Trident revoked due to inability to pass physical standards following injuries sustained in Yemen. Transferred to United States Army January 2023 with a waiver for the medical issues. He leaned back in his chair. Help me understand something, Captain. You were a Navy SEAL. One of the best, according to the parts of your file I'm actually allowed to read. Why would you voluntarily transfer to the Army to become a combatives instructor? It was a good question. It deserved an honest answer. Because I can still serve Master Chief, just differently. Sienna kept her voice level, professional. The leg works well enough for teaching, and the skills I learned, the things I was taught, they're too valuable to die with me. If I can't operate anymore, I can teach. The knowledge survives. Thorne nodded slowly. Your father was Navy Wright FA-18 pilot. Yes, Master Chief, and my mother was Navy intelligence. They died in a training accident when I was 10. Helicopter crash. I'm sorry. Thorne meant it. She could hear it in his voice. Who raised you after that? My godfather, Master Chief Thaddeus Bridger, retired SEAL Team 2. He and my father served together. Something shifted in Thorne's expression. Recognition, maybe, or respect. Stone Bridger, the Stone Bridger. You know him? Know of him? Thorne leaned forward. Cold War operations that officially never happened. Desert Storm. The man's a legend in the special operations community. He paused. He trained you. Him and 3 of his teammates from the old days. They started teaching me when I was 13. By the time I was 17, I could handle myself better than most grown men. Sienna touched her shoulder, the gesture unconscious. They prepared me for the teams, made sure I was ready for Hell Week before I ever set foot in Coronado. And you earned that trident the hard way. It wasn't a question. First woman to complete Hell Week. That must have been something. It was Master Chief. Thorne closed the file and pushed it aside. I'm going to be straight with you, Captain. This course is 8 months long. You'll be teaching alongside some of the best hand-to-hand combat instructors in the Army. Most of them are Ranger qualified. Most of them have been doing this for years. And most of them are going to have opinions about a Navy SEAL, especially a female Navy SEAL, coming into their world. I understand, Master Chief. Do you? Thorne's voice hardened slightly. Because I've already got one instructor, Staff Sergeant Cade Brennan, who's been making noise since he heard you were coming. He thinks SEALs are overrated. He thinks the Navy gave you a participation trophy. He thinks you being here is some kind of diversity initiative that undermines real standards. Sienna met his eyes. What do you think, Master Chief? Thorne was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled just slightly. I think Staff Sergeant Brennan is about to learn a very expensive lesson about making assumptions. He stood and she stood with him. Welcome aboard, Captain Vaughn. Try not to break too many of my instructors. I'll do my best, Master Chief. As she walked out of his office, Sienna felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not quite anticipation, not quite anger. Something in between, something sharp and cold and focused. She touched the trident scar on her shoulder one more time. Remember, she thought. Remember what you are. Remember what you've survived. 3 weeks she gave them. 3 weeks before everything came to a head. She was being generous. The first time Sienna saw Staff Sergeant Cade Brennan, he was demonstrating a chokehold on a training dummy in front of a class of 20 soldiers. His technique was adequate, maybe slightly better than adequate, the kind of thing you learn from a manual and practiced until it became muscle memory. Clean, efficient, functional. But it wasn't combat. Combat was messier. Combat was when your hands were wet with someone else's blood and your own fear when your heart was trying to beat out of your chest, when you'd been awake for 36 hours, and the only thing keeping you moving was the knowledge that if you stopped, people died. Combat was when the technique from the manual had to work perfectly the first time because there wouldn't be a second time. Brennan finished his demonstration and released the dummy. The class applauded politely. He saw Sienna watching from the doorway and his expression shifted, became something harder, more guarded. Can I help you? His voice was loud enough to carry to the class, loud enough to make it clear she was interrupting. Just observing, Sergeant. Continue. Sienna kept her voice neutral, professional. She'd learned a long time ago that the best way to deal with men like Brennan was to give them nothing to grab onto, no excuse to escalate. Oh, you're the Navy SEAL. Brennan said it like he was identifying a particularly interesting species of insect. The one who's supposed to teach us how real operators fight. He emphasized the word real just enough to make it an insult. The class shifted uncomfortably. Sienna could see it in their faces, that particular expression soldiers got when they sensed a confrontation between senior personnel and didn't know whose side they were supposed to be on. I'm here to share what I've learned, Sergeant. Nothing more, nothing less. What you've learned. Brennan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Right. Well, ma'am, with all due respect, some of us have been doing this for a long time. We don't need someone from the Navy coming in to tell us how to fight on land. Sienna could have responded a dozen different ways. She could have mentioned her combat record, her confirmed kills, the Silver Star citation that described in sanitized language what it meant to crawl through enemy fire to save a teammate's life. She could have asked Brennan about his combat experience, forced him to compare resumes, made him look small in front of his class. Instead, she smiled. It was the same polite smile she'd given Thorne, the smile that gave nothing away. I look forward to working with you, Sergeant. I'm sure we'll learn a lot from each other. She turned and walked away before he could respond. Behind her, she heard Colton Drake's voice, quieter, but still audible. Did you see her size? She's tiny. What's she going to teach us? How to fight from our knees? Laughter. Not from everyone, but from enough of them. Sienna kept walking. Her limp was barely noticeable, just a slight hitch in her left leg, where the nerve damage from Yemen hadn't quite healed right. Most people didn't see it unless they knew to look, but she felt it every step, a constant reminder of the IED that had ended her career as an operator and started her career as an instructor. She thought about Morgan Sinclair, her best friend, her swim buddy, the woman who'd been beside her when that IED detonated. Morgan had bled out in her arms while Sienna's broken fingers fumbled with a tourniquet that wouldn't stop the internal bleeding, wouldn't stop Morgan from dying. Don't let them forget what SEALs are made of. Morgan had said, blood on her lips, life draining out of her eyes. Promise me, Reaper. Don't let them forget. Sienna had promised. She intended to keep that promise. The third week at Fort Moore, Sienna taught her first class. 30 soldiers, mixed ranks, all volunteers for the Advanced Combatives Instructor Certification. They sat in neat rows in the classroom, notebooks, open pens ready, the universal posture of military students who'd learned that taking notes was safer than looking bored. Sienna stood at the front of the room in PT gear, her hair pulled back, the trident scar on her shoulder, visible when she turned to write on the whiteboard. She'd chosen to wear a short-sleeved shirt deliberately. Let them see it. Let them wonder. Combat is not a sport, she began. Her voice was calm, measured, the voice of someone who'd said these words before in darker places. Combat is not controlled. Combat is chaos. Combat is when someone is actively trying to kill you and you have to kill them first or die. Everything I teach you is about surviving that moment. She paused, let that sink in. Some of them were nodding. Some of them looked skeptical. Brennan sat in the back row with Drake and Reeves, his arms crossed, his expression broadcasting exactly how seriously he was taking this. Forget fair, Sienna continued. Forget rules. Forget everything you think you know about fighting from movies or sports, or even from your basic combatives training. In real combat, the only rule is survival by any means necessary. She moved to the center of the room, her movements precise, economical. I'm going to teach you techniques that work regardless of size or strength. Techniques built on leverage timing and understanding your opponent's intentions before they fully form. Because here's the truth, you will face opponents who are bigger than you, stronger than you, who have every physical advantage. You need to know how to win anyway. A hand went up. Specialist Wyatt Reeves, the youngest of Brennan's crew. Ma'am, with respect, how do we know these techniques actually work? I mean, no offense, but have you actually used them in real situations? It was a fair question. Sienna had been expecting it. Afghanistan 2018, village compound raid, secondary IED detonation. My team leader took fragmentation to the femoral artery. The medic was pinned down by machine gun fire from 2 positions, couldn't reach her. I was 38 meters away. She kept her voice level, factual, like she was describing a training exercise and not the worst night of her life. I low-crawled through incoming fire using an irrigation ditch for concealment. Rounds were impacting within inches of my position. Took me about 90 seconds to reach her. Applied a cat tourniquet while lying prone under fire, then returned fire with my primary weapon using one hand while maintaining direct pressure on the wound site with my other hand. Did that for 11 minutes until air support arrived and medevac could land. The room was absolutely silent now. Even Brennan had uncrossed his arms. She survived the helicopter ride. Died 40 hours later from a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that traveled to her lungs. But those 40 hours, that was time for her to talk to her husband on the phone. Time to tell her daughter she loved her. Time to say goodbye. Sienna's voice didn't waver. So yes, specialist, I've used these techniques in real situations. I've used them when it mattered most. And I'm going to teach them to you so that when your moment comes, you're ready. For the rest of the class, no one looked skeptical. No one looked bored. They took notes. They asked questions. They paid attention. All except Brennan, who sat in the back row with his jaw tight and his eyes hard, looking like a man who just realized he'd underestimated something and didn't know what to do about it. After class, as the students filed out, Specialist Beckett Hayes approached her. He was 25 infantry with the careful movements of someone who'd seen combat and learned to be wary. He waited until the room was empty before speaking. Ma'am, can I ask you something personal? Go ahead, Specialist. My uncle was SEAL Team 4 in the early 2000s. He told me stories about a woman who made it through Hell Week in 2017, first female to complete it. Said she earned a trident scar during some hazing incident that went too far. Hayes hesitated. Is that you? Sienna looked at him for a long moment, weighing her answer. Then she slowly rolled up her right sleeve, revealing the faded trident burned into her shoulder. The raised tissue caught the fluorescent light, clearly visible even from across the room. Hayes's eyes widened. Jesus, my uncle said it was legendary. Said most men would have quit after that, but you kept going. Finished 5th overall in your class. Your uncle talks too much, Specialist. Yes, ma'am, but he also said something else. Hayes glanced at the door, making sure they were alone. He said Brennan and his crew are planning something, some kind of public challenge. They think you're proof that standards were lowered, that the Navy gave you a participation trophy. They want to prove it. Sienna had suspected as much. Men like Brennan always wanted to prove something, usually to themselves more than anyone else. I appreciate the warning specialist. Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying, you should be careful. Brennan has friends. Command Sergeant Major Garrett Pierce just arrived on post, and he's been encouraging this kind of thing. He's got it out for SEALs thinks special operations gets too much credit. They're setting you up. Let them specialist. Sienna kept her voice calm. I didn't survive Hell Week to be intimidated by Ranger School graduates. Hayes nodded slowly, something like respect in his eyes. My uncle always said SEALs were different. Now I think I understand why. After he left, Sienna stood alone in the empty classroom. She touched the trident scar through her shirt, a gesture that had become almost unconscious over the years. The tissue was raised rough under her fingertips, a permanent reminder of the worst and best moment of her life. Hell Week Hour 106. 21 years old, hypothermic beyond exhaustion, every muscle screaming. And then the senior candidates holding her down while someone pressed heated metal into her shoulder, burning the SEAL trident into her flesh. It had been meant to break her, to give her an excuse to quit. Instead, it had made her stronger. Remember, she whispered to herself. Remember what you survived. Remember what you are. Tomorrow she would call Stone, her godfather, her mentor, the man who'd raised her and trained her and believed in her when the rest of the world said women couldn't be SEALs. Tomorrow she would prepare. But tonight she would remember. 22 years earlier, the rain hammered down on the funeral canopy with the relentless rhythm of a dirge. Sienna Vaughn was 10 years old, standing between two caskets draped in American flags, and she didn't cry because crying was for later, when she was alone, when no one could see her break. Her father's coffin held what was left of Lieutenant Commander Marcus Vaughn, Navy FA-18 pilot, 34 years old, killed when his helicopter went down during a training exercise off the Virginia coast. Her mother's coffin held what was left of Commander Jennifer Vaughn, Naval Intelligence, 33 years old, killed in the same accident because she'd been on that helicopter too, observing the exercise, doing her job right up until the moment the rotors failed and the aircraft dropped into the Atlantic like a stone. The chaplain was saying something about service and sacrifice and the eternal peace of heroes. Sienna wasn't listening. She was watching the rain hit the caskets, watching the water bead and roll off the flags, thinking about how her parents had both been swimming when the helicopter hit the water, but neither of them made it to the surface. The official report said they'd been knocked unconscious by the impact. Sienna thought that was probably a lie, a kind lie, meant to comfort their daughter, but a lie nonetheless. The funeral ended. People filed past, shaking her hand, saying how sorry they were, how her parents had been wonderful people, how she should be so proud. Sienna shook their hands and said thank you and didn't feel anything at all, because feeling things would mean accepting that this was real and permanent and irreversible. Then a man approached who didn't offer his hand. He was 52 years old, tall and lean, with gray threading through his dark hair and eyes that had seen things Sienna couldn't imagine. He wore his dress uniform, and the ribbon rack on his chest told a story of its own: Navy Cross Silver Star, multiple Bronze Stars, Purple Heart. The trident on his chest marked him as a SEAL. Master Chief Thaddeus Bridger knelt down so he was at her eye level. Sienna, he said, and his voice was gentle but not pitying, which made all the difference. I'm Stone, your father's friend. Do you remember me? She did barely. A tall man who'd come to their house sometimes, who'd talked with her father about things she didn't understand, who'd always treated her like she mattered even though she was just a kid. Your father made me promise something a long time ago, Stone said. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him and your mother, I would look after you. He wanted to make sure you'd be okay, that you'd be raised by someone who understood what it meant to be a warrior's daughter. Sienna found her voice. It came out smaller than she wanted. Am I going to live with you? If you want to, if that's okay with you. Stone's eyes were steady, honest. I live in Virginia Beach. I've got a house with a garage that I turned into a training space. I'm retired now, but I still teach sometimes. Hand-to-hand combat survival skills, things your father thought were important. Why did my father pick you? Because he knew me, because we served together. Because when we were in Pakistan on a mission that officially never happened, I carried him 6 miles through hostile territory after he took shrapnel in his leg and couldn't walk. He said anyone who'd do that was someone he could trust with his daughter. Sienna looked at the caskets, then back at Stone. Did you teach him to fight? I did. Your father was a pilot, but he wanted to know how to protect himself if he ever got shot down in bad territory. So I taught him. Stone paused. He was good at it too. Better than most. Could you teach me? Something shifted in Stone's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Yes, if that's what you want. I want to be strong, Sienna said. I don't want to feel like this anymore. I don't want to be helpless. Stone nodded slowly. Then we'll start training when you're ready. Not today, not tomorrow. But when you're ready, I'll teach you everything I know. And he had. For the next 11 years, Stonebridger raised Sienna Vaughn like she was his own daughter. He taught her discipline and resilience and how to push through pain that felt impossible. Every morning started at 0500 with physical training, running swimming calisthenics, until her muscles burned and her lungs screamed. He taught her hand-to-hand combat in the garage behind his house, the space smelling like sweat and old leather, the concrete floor worn smooth from decades of footwork and falls. Stone brought in his old teammates from SEAL Team 2 men who'd served with him during the Cold War and Desert Storm men who'd operated in places that didn't exist on maps. Senior Chief Nathaniel Carmichael taught her demolitions and marksmanship, taking her to private land where she learned to shoot with precision that made grown men nervous. Chief Warrant Officer Garrett Sutherland taught her field medicine and survival skills, how to navigate without GPS, and how to keep someone alive with limited supplies. Commander Donovan Blackwood taught her tactical thinking, how to make decisions under pressure when all your options were terrible. But Stone taught her the most important lesson, that combat wasn't about size or strength. It was about leverage and timing and understanding your opponent's intention before they committed to it. You'll never be the biggest person in a fight, he told her 1,000 times. So you become the smartest, the fastest, the most technically precise. You learn to read people, to see the attack before it happens, to use their own force against them. When Sienna was 16, 3 senior boys from her high school cornered her behind the gym after a basketball game. They'd been drinking, which made them bold and stupid in equal measure. They thought she was an easy target, a small girl walking alone in the dark, no witnesses around. The first one grabbed her arm. She broke his nose with a palm strike to the face the way Stone had taught her, driving through the target rather than just slapping at it. The second one rushed in and she used his momentum, turned her hip, executed an osotogari sweep that sent him hard into the pavement. The third one hesitated, which was his first mistake. His second mistake was trying to grab her from behind. She drove her elbow into his solar plexus, hooked his leg, took him down, and had him in an arm lock before he understood what was happening. Stone found her 5 minutes later, standing calm near 3 boys who were still trying to figure out what had hit them. One was holding his bleeding nose. One was curled up trying to breathe. One was cradling his arm where the joint had been stressed almost to the breaking point. Stone looked at the scene, looked at his goddaughter, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, come with me. He drove her to the VFW hall on the south side of town, the place where old warriors gathered to tell stories and remember friends who hadn't made it home. Stone led her inside during one of their evening meetings, and 4 older men stood up from a card table when they saw Stone's expression. "Gentlemen," Stone said, "my goddaughter just put 3 grown men on the ground behind her high school, used techniques I taught her, did it without panic, without hesitation, without losing control. I think it's time you met her properly." Senior Chief Nathaniel Carmichael, 68 years old, Cold War veteran, stepped forward and offered his hand. "Your godfather has told us a lot about you, Sienna. Said you had warrior blood. Looks like he was right." Chief Warrant Officer Garrett Sutherland, 66, studied her with the careful eyes of a man who'd spent years evaluating potential. "Takes discipline to control yourself like that, to use exactly enough force and no more. That's what separates operators from thugs." Commander Donovan Blackwood, 71, the eldest of the group, simply nodded. "Your parents would be proud. Your father told me once that he hoped you'd grow up strong. I'd say you've exceeded his expectations." Stone put his hand on Sienna's shoulder. "Sienna, these are the men I served with during the Cold War and Desert Storm. We operated in Lebanon, Iran, places where the missions were so classified that officially they never happened. We've seen combat in its truest form. We've survived when others didn't. And we've agreed that we're going to teach you everything we know." "Why?" Sienna asked. "Why me?" Because you have what it takes, Stone said simply. Because your parents were warriors and you carry that legacy. Because the world needs warriors who understand that competence has no gender requirement. Because when you're ready, you're going to try out for the SEAL teams and you're going to become exactly what the Navy needs, but doesn't know it yet. For the next 4 years, those four men became Sienna's true teachers. They met 3 times a week, sometimes more, and they taught her things that weren't in any manual. They taught her how to think like an operator, how to control fear instead of being controlled by it, how to push through barriers that felt impossible. And when she was 21 years old, when she stood on the beach at Coronado, California, about to begin basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, Stone pulled her aside one last time. Buds is designed to break you, he said, especially Hell Week. 5.5 days, 4 hours of total sleep, constant cold and wet and exhausted. Most of your class will quit. They'll ring the bell and walk away, and nobody will judge them for it. But you're not going to quit. How do you know? Because I raised you, because I know what you're made of, because you've been preparing for this your whole life. Stone's eyes were steady. They're going to test you in ways you can't imagine. They're going to do things that cross lines because they want to see if you'll break. But you won't. You'll earn that trident, Sienna. And when you do, when you become a SEAL, you'll prove something important, that warriors come in all forms. He was right, and he was wrong, because they did test her. They did cross lines, and during hour 106 of Hell Week, when she was hypothermic and beyond exhaustion, when every muscle in her body was screaming and her mind was starting to fracture from sleep deprivation, senior candidates held her down in the chaos and burned a trident into her shoulder with heated metal. It was meant to break her. It made her stronger. She finished Hell Week. She earned her trident. She became a SEAL. And now, 7 years later, standing in a training pit at Fort Moore, with 3 Army soldiers circling her like predators, Sienna touched that scar one more time and remembered exactly what it meant. The only easy day was yesterday. Tomorrow was never easy, but she was ready. She had always been ready. The whistle was about to blow. Day 19. The harassment started subtle, the way these things always did. Cade Brennan would make comments during morning information, just loud enough for his crew to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Heard the Navy's sending us their diversity hires now. Guess they ran out of real operators. Colton Drake would laugh on cue, that braying sound of a man who'd never had an original thought in his life. Wyatt Reeves would shift uncomfortably, but say nothing, caught between his conscience and his desire to belong. Sienna heard every word. She was meant to. That was the point. During her second week of classes, she taught a module on close quarters combat, demonstrating how to neutralize a larger opponent using leverage rather than strength. The techniques were fundamental, the kind of things she'd learned from Stone and refined through years of actual combat. Simple, efficient, effective. Brennan raised his hand from the back row. His voice carried that particular tone of false respect that was really contempt wearing a uniform. Ma'am, with all due respect, these techniques look great against a compliant training partner. But how do we know they work against someone who's actually trying to hurt you, someone with real combat training? The implication was clear. Someone like me. Someone big and strong and male. Sienna looked at him for a long moment. The room went quiet, that particular military silence that meant everyone was paying attention, even if they pretended not to be. That's an excellent question, Sergeant Brennan. She kept her voice level, professional. The answer is that these techniques have been tested extensively in real combat situations by SEAL operators in multiple theaters. They work because they're based on biomechanical principles that don't change based on the size or strength of the opponent. But you've personally used them in actual combat against actual enemies who were trying to kill you. Another implication. You specifically, not some hypothetical SEAL operator, but you personally. Yes, Sergeant, I have. Against men. The room got quieter somehow. Even the soldiers who'd been taking notes had stopped writing. Against anyone who presented a threat. Men, women combatants who were significantly larger than me and highly motivated to end my life. The techniques worked because I trained them to the point where they became instinct. That's what I'm teaching you to do. Brennan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Well, ma'am, some of us have been doing this a long time. We've got Ranger School deployment experience, years of training. No offense, but we've seen a lot of techniques that look good in a classroom, but don't hold up in reality. Sienna could have ended it right there. She could have repeated her combat record, the 27 confirmed kills, the Navy Cross recommendation, the Silver Star citation. She could have described in detail what it felt like to fight for your life in a dark corridor in Mosul with an ISIS fighter twice her size trying to choke her unconscious. She could have made Brennan look very small in front of his students, but that would have been playing his game, and she was better than that. Then I suppose we'll have to make sure the training is realistic enough to satisfy your standards, Sergeant. I appreciate the feedback. She turned back to the class and continued the lesson. Behind her, she heard Brennan mutter something to Drake that made both men laugh quietly. She didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. After class, Specialist Beckett Hayes approached her again. He had that careful expression of someone who wanted to help but didn't want to overstep. Ma'am, it's getting worse. Brennan's been talking to Command Sergeant Major Pierce. They're planning something. I know, Specialist. Do you want me to report it? I can go through my chain of command, make it official. No. Sienna kept her voice gentle but firm. I appreciate the offer, but that would only make things worse. They'd accuse me of hiding behind my rank of being unable to handle normal military banter. This needs to play out. Hayes looked troubled. Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying, you shouldn't have to put up with this. You earned your place here. More than earned it. I know, Specialist, but sometimes earning your place isn't enough. Sometimes you have to prove it over and over until people run out of excuses to doubt you. She smiled slightly. Don't worry. I've been through worse than Staff Sergeant Brennan. That night alone in her quarters, Sienna pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long time before finally making the call. It was 2100 hours on the East Coast, a reasonable time, but she still hesitated before pressing the button. Stone answered on the second ring. Sienna. His voice was exactly the same as it had always been, gravelly and steady, the voice of a man who'd seen the worst the world had to offer and come through it intact. I was wondering when you'd call. How did you know I would? Because I know you. And I know what happens when women try to prove themselves in places that don't want them. How bad is it? Sienna moved to the window, looked out at the Fort Moore training grounds lit by security lights. Staff Sergeant Cade Brennan, Ranger School graduate, combat deployment to Afghanistan, thinks SEALs are overrated Hollywood marketing. He's been pushing for 3 weeks now, making comments undermining my classes, challenging my credentials. And you've been handling it professionally? Of course. But it's escalating. Yes. Sienna touched the trident scar through her shirt, that unconscious gesture. He wants to make it physical. He wants a public demonstration, something that proves I don't belong here. And he's got support from a command sergeant major who doesn't like SEALs. Stone was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, could picture him sitting in his living room in Virginia Beach, the walls covered with photos from deployments that officially never happened. Finally, he spoke. What do you want to do? Part of me wants to refuse, walk away, take the high road, prove that I'm above this kind of schoolyard challenge. And the other part wants to show him exactly what a SEAL combat master means, wants to teach him a lesson he'll never forget. Good. Stone's voice carried approval. The first instinct is political. The second instinct is right. Sienna, listen to me carefully. You're not proving anything to Brennan. Men like him will never be convinced no matter what you do. You're teaching a lesson for everyone else. For every soldier who's watching. For every woman who'll come after you. For Jade Holloway, who died believing that female operators mattered. For Morgan Sinclair, who told you not to let anyone forget what SEALs are made of. Sienna felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. He's going to challenge me publicly. 3-on-1, him, his sergeant, and a specialist. They think the numbers advantage will prove their point. 3-on-1. Stone laughed a short bark of amusement. Sienna, do they have any idea who they're challenging? Do they know what you've done, what you've survived? They know I'm former SEAL. They know I was medically retired. They think that means I was broken, that I couldn't hack it anymore. Then they're idiots. Stone's voice hardened. You weren't broken. You were rebuilt. And the warrior who's been broken and rebuilt is always stronger than the one who's never been tested. Brennan doesn't understand that. He thinks physical size is the only thing that matters in combat. You're going to teach him otherwise. I'm scared, Stone. The words came out quieter than she intended. Not of them, of myself, of how much I want to hurt them. They keep pushing and pushing, and I keep thinking about Morgan dying in my arms, about Jade bleeding out, because politicians decided women shouldn't be in combat even though we were already there. I'm scared I'm going to lose control. You won't. Stone's certainty was absolute. You know why? Because I trained you. Because you've been in real combat where losing control meant people died. Because you're a professional, and professionals don't let emotions dictate their actions. You'll do exactly what needs to be done, no more and no less. That's what makes you dangerous. Sienna closed her eyes. Tell me about the Cold War. Tell me about Lebanon. Stone understood immediately what she was asking for. Not a war story, but a reminder, a connection to the legacy she carried. Lebanon, 1983. I was 29 years old, part of a SEAL Team 2 element operating in Beirut. We were doing reconnaissance on Hezbollah positions, and things went sideways fast. Got pinned down in a building, 6 of us against maybe 30 hostiles. We were outgunned, outmanned, trapped. What did you do? We adapted, used what we had. Superior training, better tactics, understanding that panic was the enemy. We held that position for 6 hours until extraction arrived. 3 of us were wounded, but all 6 made it out. You know why? Why? Because we trusted our training, because we didn't let size or numbers intimidate us, because we knew that competence beats capability every single time. That's what I taught you, Sienna. That's what you carry inside you. Don't forget it. I won't. The only easy day was yesterday, Stone said, and she could hear the smile in his voice now. Tomorrow's never easy, but you're ready. You've always been ready. After they hung up, Sienna sat in the darkness for a long time, touching the trident scar, remembering Hell Week. Remembering the moment when they'd held her down and burned that mark into her flesh, thinking it would break her. She was still here. They weren't. That meant something. Day 21 on in, the formal proposal came through official channels, which meant Command Sergeant Major Garrett Pierce had been working behind the scenes to make this happen. The document was professionally written, full of the right terminology, structured like a legitimate training evolution, rather than what it actually was, a setup designed to humiliate her publicly. 3-on-1 demonstration. Focus on defensive tactics under numerical disadvantage. Staff Sergeant Cade Brennan, Sergeant Colton Drake, and Specialist Wyatt Reeves versus Captain Sienna Vaughn. Controlled techniques, immediate stop on taps or verbal submission. Command Sergeant Major Augustus Thorne as primary safety officer. Thorne called her to his office when the proposal landed on his desk. He looked tired, older than his 63 years, a man who'd seen enough politics to know when he was being maneuvered into an impossible position. Captain Vaughn, I want you to understand that I tried to kill this. I went to the brigade commander, explained that this was harassment disguised as training. But Pierce went around me, got approval at a level I can't fight, not 8 months from retirement. I understand, Master Chief. Do you bow? Thorne leaned forward, his eyes intense. Because this isn't just about you anymore. This is institutional. Pierce has been vocal about his belief that special operations gets too much credit, too many resources. He thinks SEALs specifically are overrated. He's using you to make a point. Then I'll make a different point. Captain, you don't have to do this. I can still find a way to shut it down, take the political heat. Master Chief, Sienna kept her voice steady. With respect, I do have to do this, not for me. For every woman who'll come after me. If I back down, it confirms everything Brennan believes. But if I show them what SEAL training actually produces, what happens when you take someone small and teach them to use every advantage they have, maybe the next woman who walks through these gates won't face this. Thorne studied her face for a long moment. You sound like your godfather. Stone Bridger was stubborn as hell too. He taught me well. He did. Thorne sighed. All right, Captain, we'll do this, but I'm primary safety officer, and I mean that. If Brennan or his crew crosses a line, if anyone violates safety protocols, I will pull them immediately regardless of politics. Understood. Yes, Master Chief. And Captain, Thorne's expression softened slightly. For what it's worth, I've been doing this job for 40 years. I've trained thousands of soldiers, and I can tell when someone really knows their craft, versus when someone just memorized the manual. You're the real thing. Whatever happens in that ring, you remember that. Sienna left his office feeling that tightness in her chest again, that mixture of anger and determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. She had 72 hours until the demonstration. 72 hours to prepare, to plan, to make sure she was ready. She'd been preparing for this her whole life. Day 22, the call with Stone that night, it lasted 2 hours. Sienna sat on the floor of her quarters, phone on speaker, going through mental preparation the way they'd done before every mission during her SEAL days. Tell me about them, Stone said. Everything you've observed. Brennan, 6'3", 235, all muscle. Ranger School honor graduate, which means he's got solid fundamentals. He favors his right side, and there's an old shoulder injury from Ranger training. Rotator cuff, probably. He telegraphs his strikes with a slight shoulder dip before he commits. Good. You've been studying him. That's the difference between a fighter and an operator. Fighters react. Operators plan. Drake is shorter, maybe 5'10", 200 pounds. Follower mentality. He'll do whatever Brennan does, which makes him predictable. Probably goes for power over technique. And the kid, Wyatt Reeves, 23, 5'11", 190. He's uncomfortable with the whole situation. I can see it in his body language during classes. He's being pressured to participate. That's useful. When people fight because they're being forced to rather than because they want to, they hesitate. Hesitation is a weakness you can exploit. Sienna shifted position, felt the twinge in her left leg where the nerve damage from Yemen still bothered her. Stone, what if the leg gives out? The medic said the nerve damage is permanent. Under extreme stress, I might lose function. Then you adapt. SEALs don't make excuses, we find solutions. If the leg fails, you fight from the ground. You've got submissions from guard, from mount, from back control. You've trained every position. Stone's voice softened slightly. But it won't fail, Sienna. You know why. Why, Badi? Because your body knows what's at stake. Because in real combat situations, adrenaline overrides pain and limitation. Because you've got something Brennan will never have. You've been in fights where losing meant death. This is just Tuesday to you. Sienna smiled despite herself. Just Tuesday. Tell me your plan. Let them come to me. They'll be aggressive, trying to overwhelm with size and numbers. I'll use that aggression against them, make them chase, make them overcommit. Brennan will lead because his ego won't let him do anything else. I'll take him down first, quick and clean, to shake their confidence. Then Drake, then Reeves. What about Brennan's shoulder? Sienna was quiet for a moment. I could target it. One good Kimura and that rotator cuff would fail. He'd be done. But you won't. No, I won't. Why not? Because that would prove I needed his weakness to beat him. I want to beat him at full strength using pure technique against his size advantage. I want everyone watching to understand that it wasn't about finding a flaw. It was about being better. Stone made a satisfied sound. That's my girl. You're not just winning a fight. You're teaching a lesson about competence versus capability, about technique versus strength, about what happens when someone small knows more than someone big. They talked through scenarios, ran mental simulations, discussed every possible variation. By the time they finished, Sienna felt centered, focused the way she used to feel before missions in Syria and Yemen. Sienna with Stone said finally, I want you to remember something. Tomorrow when you're in that ring, you're not just representing yourself. You're representing every operator I ever trained, every SEAL who believed women belonged in the teams. Your parents who would be so damn proud of what you've become. Jade Holloway who died believing female operators mattered. Morgan Sinclair who told you to never let anyone forget what SEALs are made of. I remember. And remember this too, you're a SEAL combat master. That's not just a certification. That's a statement about who you are and what you've accomplished. Make sure they remember it too. After the call ended, Sienna performed her pre-mission ritual. She'd done it before every combat operation, the same sequence every time. It was superstition and discipline mixed together, a way of connecting the present moment to all the moments that came before. First, she took out the small wooden box where she kept the dog tags. Jade Holloway's tags were worn smooth, the metal dark with age and handling. She held them for a moment, remembering Jade's voice calm and steady, even as she bled out in that compound in Kandahar. For you, Lieutenant, she whispered, you believed female operators mattered. I'm going to prove you were right. Then Morgan Sinclair's tags anew were still bright. Morgan had only been 27 when she died, younger than Sienna was now. The tag still smelled faintly of the desert of dust and smoke and copper. For you, Morg, I won't let them forget. Finally, she touched the trident scar on her shoulder, traced the raised tissue with her fingertips. The mark was 7 years old now, faded but permanent, a reminder of what she'd survived and what she'd earned. For everyone who doubted, she said to the empty room, tomorrow you learn. She lay back on her bunk, closed her eyes, and began the mental preparation. Visualization, the kind of thing sports psychologists taught, but SEALs had been doing for decades. She saw herself in the ring, saw Brennan and Drake and Reeves coming at her, saw every movement, every counter, every transition, ran through the fight 100 times in her mind, each variation slightly different, until she'd prepared for every possibility. Her breathing slowed, deepened, fell into the rhythm she'd learned during SEER training. 4 counts and hold, for 4, 4 counts, out, hold for 4. Combat breathing, the kind that kept you calm when bullets were snapping past your head and friends were dying around you. The only easy day was yesterday. Tomorrow was never easy. But she was ready. Meanwhile, in the barracks across the compound, Cade Brennan sat with Colton Drake and Wyatt Reeves going through their own preparation. The difference was stark. This is going to be over in under a minute, Brennan said, confidence absolute. She's what, 5'4", maybe 140 pounds, soaking wet. 3 of us will overwhelm her immediately. Drake nodded eagerly. And when we do, when we show everyone that size and strength matter more than some fancy SEAL certification, it'll prove what we've been saying all along. Reeves was quieter. He'd been quiet a lot lately, ever since his conversation with Beckett Hayes, who told him what his uncle had said about Sienna, about Hell Week, about combat deployments, about earning that trident scar the hard way. You guys ever think maybe we're wrong about this? Reeves said, his voice tentative. Brennan looked at him like he'd just spoken a foreign language. Wrong about what? About her. I mean, she did complete Hell Week. First woman ever. That's not nothing. Hell Week is endurance, not combat. Brennan's voice hardened. It's about suffering through cold and exhaustion. That doesn't mean she can actually fight. We're trained combatants, Wyatt. Ranger qualified. We know what we're doing. I just think maybe you think too much. Brennan cut him off. Tomorrow you do what we planned. We come at her from 3 angles, overwhelm her, immediately put her on the ground and make her tap. Quick and clean. It'll prove the point without anyone getting hurt. What Brennan didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Sienna had been studying him for 3 weeks. She'd watched every class he taught, observed every demonstration, noted every tell and habit and weakness. She'd cataloged his old shoulder injury, the way he favored his right side, the slight telegraph before his strikes. She knew his game better than he knew it himself. That was the difference between a fighter and an operator. Fighters reacted to what was in front of them. Operators planned for what was coming. Day 23, the morning of the demonstration, dawned clear and hot. Typical Georgia December weather that felt more like early fall than winter. Sienna woke at 0500 out of habit, went through her normal PT routine, even though her body was already warm and loose. Running helped her think, and she had a lot to think about. At 0700, she called Stone one more time. You ready? He asked, no greeting necessary. I think so. Stone, I need you to know something. Whatever happens today, thank you. For everything. For raising me after Mom and Dad died. For training me. For believing in me when the Navy brass said women couldn't be SEALs. For making me who I am. Stone's voice roughened with emotion. Your parents asked me to look after you if anything happened. I did more than that. I raised a warrior who made them proud, who made the teams proud, who made me proud. You don't need to thank me for that, Sienna. It's been the honor of my life. I'm going to make you proud today, too. You already have, but go ahead and remind everyone else what that means. They talked for 20 more minutes, final tactical considerations, last-minute adjustments to the plan. When they hung up, Sienna felt that familiar calm settling over her. The same calm she'd felt before missions in Mosul, in Damascus, in Sana'a. Not the absence of fear, but the acceptance of it. Fear was information. Fear told you the stakes mattered. She spent the rest of the morning in her quarters, staying out of sight, avoiding the pre-fight gossip and speculation she knew would be spreading through Fort Moore like wildfire. At 1300 hours, she dressed in PT gear, pulled her hair back into a tight bun, and stood in front of the mirror. The woman looking back at her was 28 years old, scarred and lean, and harder than she'd been at 21. The trident mark on her shoulder was visible through the thin fabric of her shirt. Her left leg still bore the surgical scars from Yemen. Her hands had calluses from 1,000 hours on the range and in the training pit. She looked like what she was, a weapon forged through trial and tempered through combat. Remember, she said to her reflection. Remember what you are. Remember what you've surveyed, bound. Remember that you're a SEAL combat master. She touched the trident scar one last time. Then she walked out the door toward the training pit, toward the confrontation that had been building for 3 weeks, toward the moment when she would teach Cade Brennan and everyone else watching a lesson they would never forget. The only easy day was yesterday. Today was going to be very hard, for everyone except her. By 1330, the word had spread through Fort Moore like a tactical fire. Soldiers who had no official reason to be near the training pit found excuses to walk past, to lean against the fence, to position themselves where they could watch. The bleachers filled quickly, not just with students from the combatives course, but with instructors, support personnel, even a few officers who'd heard rumors and wanted to see what happened when Navy and Army collided. 88 people gathered in total, the largest crowd the training pit had seen in years. Beckett Hayes sat in the front row, his expression troubled. His uncle had called that morning, told him to make sure someone was recording this, that it was going to be historic one way or another. Hayes had his phone ready, praying that whatever happened wouldn't end careers or lives. Command Sergeant Major Augustus Thorne stood at the ring's edge, whistle around his neck, and his hands weren't quite steady. He'd been in combat, he'd seen soldiers die, he'd made hard decisions under impossible circumstances. But this felt different somehow, more personal, more consequential. He'd tried one last time that morning to shut this down, and Pierce had told him in very clear terms that if he interfered, his retirement would be significantly less comfortable than planned. So here he was about to oversee a fight he knew was wrong, because sometimes doing your job meant enabling things you opposed. 200 meters away in his office, Vice Admiral Marshall Blackstone watched through binoculars. He'd arrived at Fort Moore the previous evening, checked into a hotel off-post, told no one he was coming. Stonebridger had called him 72 hours ago, explained the situation, asked if he could provide oversight without interfering. Blackstone had commanded SEAL Team 6 for 4 years. He'd seen every kind of warrior, every type of courage and cowardice, and everything in between. He knew Sienna Vaughan's reputation, had read her classified file, understood exactly what she'd accomplished and what she'd survived. He was here to make sure justice was done, one way or another. At 13:55, 5 minutes before the scheduled start time, Cade Brennan, Colton Drake, and Wyatt Reeves entered the ring together. They had coordinated their appearance, wore identical black PT shorts and tan shirts, moved with the synchronized confidence of men who believed absolutely in their own superiority. Brennan shadowboxed as he walked, showing off for the crowd, rolling his shoulders and neck. Drake fed off his energy, bouncing on his toes, grinning. Reeves followed more reluctantly, his expression suggesting he'd rather be literally anywhere else. The crowd's energy shifted when they entered. Cheers from some soldiers, the ones who saw this as entertainment. Silence from others, the ones who understood they were watching something darker. Then at 13:58, Sienna Vaughn walked through the gate alone. No entourage, no fanfare, no dramatic entrance. She simply appeared, moving with that slight limp from Yemen, wearing standard gray PT gear, her auburn hair pulled back so severely it made her face look even leaner. The trident scar on her shoulder caught the afternoon light. She walked to the center of the ring and stopped. Settled into a neutral stance, feet shoulder-width apart, hands loose at her sides, weight centered and balanced. Her face held an expression that wasn't quite blank, but was certainly calm. The kind of calm that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of and having nothing left to prove to anyone except yourself. She looked small, standing there dwarfed by the 3 men who'd already entered the ring. 5'4" next to Brennan's 6'3", 138 pounds against his 235. The visual was stark, almost comical. That was the point. That was what Brennan had been counting on. Sienna touched the trident scar on her shoulder, once a gesture so brief most people missed it. Her lips moved words too quiet for anyone to hear. Remember, I'm a SEAL combat master. Command Sergeant Major Thorne stepped to the center of the ring. His voice carried clearly across the training area, amplified by decades of command presence. This is a controlled training evolution. All techniques must maintain partner safety. Tap verbal submission, or my whistle means immediate stop. Any soldier who fails to comply will be removed from this course and face disciplinary action under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Medical personnel are standing by. I have authority to halt this match at any time for any reason. His eyes moved to Brennan. When he said it, lingered there for just a moment. Are these rules understood? Brennan nodded, his jaw set, barely able to contain his eagerness. Drake nodded too, that follower's automatic agreement. Reeves nodded last reluctantly. Thorne looked at Sienna. She gave a single nod, economical and precise. The crowd held its collective breath. Cade Brennan leaned slightly toward Colton Drake and whispered just loud enough for Sienna's ears, "Navy's about to learn they sent us a glorified swimmer." Sienna heard it, smiled slightly. In her mind, she was 21 years old again, standing in the surf at Coronado with an instructor screaming that she should quit. She was remembering what Stone had told her 1,000 times: competence beats capability, technique beats strength, understanding beats size. She was remembering Morgan Sinclair's last words: "Don't let them forget what SEALs are made of." She was remembering every hour of training, every combat deployment, every moment that had forged her into what she was. Augustus Thorne raised the whistle to his lips. The afternoon sun blazed down on the red Georgia clay. 88 people watched and waited, and in that moment before the whistle blew, Sienna Vaughn felt absolutely perfectly calm. The only easy day was yesterday. But today, she was going to teach a lesson that no one in this training pit would ever forget. The whistle blew. 3 men charged forward, and the world learned what it meant to challenge a SEAL combat master. The whistle's shrill cry cut through the Georgia afternoon like a blade, and Cade Brennan moved first because his ego demanded it. 6'3", 235 pounds of muscle and certainty, he shot forward with a double-leg takedown that had worked 1,000 times in training. Head down, arms reaching, driving with every ounce of force his legs could generate. In his mind, this would be over in seconds. Drive the small woman to the ground, establish dominant position, make her tap. Quick, clean, decisive. Sienna Vaughn pivoted 30 degrees to her right. The movement was so small, so economical, that from the bleachers it looked like she'd barely moved at all. But that tiny adjustment changed everything. Brennan's momentum, all that mass and force he'd committed, carried him past empty air where she'd been standing a fraction of a second earlier. His hands grasped at nothing. His balance, perfect when driving forward, became precarious when his target disappeared. Before his brain could process what had happened, before he could plant his feet and recover, Sienna was already moving. She'd rotated with his momentum, staying in his blind spot, and now she threaded her right arm under his armpit while her left hand found his belt. She wasn't trying to stop his forward motion. She was using it, redirecting it, adding her own force to his, until he had no choice but to go where she guided him, which was face first into the packed red clay. The impact drove air from Brennan's lungs in an audible grunt that carried across the training pit. Dust puffed up around him. For one stunned moment, he lay there trying to understand how he'd ended up on the ground when he'd been so certain of his attack. The crowd murmured. That sound, that collective intake of breath, meant they'd seen something they hadn't expected. That wasn't luck. That was technique refined through thousands of repetitions until it became instinct. Sienna released him immediately, not from mercy, but from tactics. She rolled away, creating distance, and rose to her feet in one fluid motion. Her face remained calm, expressionless. She reset to neutral stance and waited. Colton Drake rushed in from her left side while Brennan was still processing what had happened. Drake was shorter than his leader, but thicker built like a linebacker, and he came in swinging. A wide looping right hook telegraphed by the way his shoulder dipped and his weight shifted onto his front foot a full second before his fist moved. It was the kind of punch that worked on drunk civilians and exhausted privates, but nowhere else. Sienna slipped inside his reach, making herself smaller, her head moving just enough to avoid the punch. Before Drake's arm had fully extended, before he understood his strike had missed, she was already executing the counter. An osotogari, a major outer reap, one of the fundamental judo throws that Stone had drilled into her 10,000 times. Her right leg hooked behind Drake's left leg, while her hands controlled his upper body, and she used his own forward momentum to take him off balance. Drake hit the ground hard. The impact was solid, meaty, the sound of a 200-pound man meeting earth with no way to break his fall. Air exploded from his lungs in a grunt that sounded almost comical. He lay there for a moment, stunned, trying to remember how to breathe. Wyatt Reeves came from her right, trying to time his attack while she was focused on Drake. He was smarter than the first two, more cautious, and he attempted a body lock from the sidearms, reaching to wrap around her torso and use his size advantage to control her. It was a good tactical decision, better than what Brennan and Drake had tried. But Sienna felt his approach through peripheral awareness, that sixth sense that operators developed after enough time in combat. She knew he was there before he touched her, and she dropped her level, suddenly changing her height, slipping under his arms before they could close around her. Then she drove her shoulder into his solar plexus just below the rib cage, a targeted strike that disrupted his breathing and his balance simultaneously. Reeves stumbled backward, coughing, his hands coming up to his midsection. His face showed surprise more than pain. He hadn't expected her to be that fast, that precise. All of this happened in the first 15 seconds. Brennan pushed himself up, angrier, now breathing harder. The easy victory he'd expected hadn't materialized. The crowd had seen him taken down by someone a foot shorter and 90 pounds lighter. His ego, that driving force behind all of this, couldn't absorb that reality. He came in again, more careful this time, trying to use his wrestling base properly. He set up a collar tie, one hand behind Sienna's neck, the other controlling her right arm, and he started to drive forward with his weight advantage. For 3 seconds, it looked like it might work. He was moving her backward, using his mass, his strength, everything the manual said should work against a smaller opponent. Then Sienna turned her head sharply to the left. The movement was small, no more than 45 degrees, but it broke the structural integrity of his grip. Her neck slipped free from his hand, and suddenly the force he'd been applying had nothing to push against. Before he could adjust, she'd used that same principle Stone had taught her 1,000 times: use your opponent's force against them. She executed a lateral drop, taking him to the ground while maintaining top position. She landed with her weight distributed perfectly across his chest, her knees settling on either side of his rib cage. Her hands found his right arm and trapped it in a Kimura grip, that figure four configuration that put tremendous pressure on the shoulder joint. She didn't crank, it didn't apply the force that would dislocate his shoulder. She just held the position, demonstrating control, showing everyone watching that she could finish the submission, but was choosing not to. The message was unmistakable: I could end this. I'm being merciful. Brennan should have tapped. Pride stopped him. Instead, he tried to explode out of the position, using raw strength to bridge, violently lifting his hips to throw her off. It was exactly the wrong response against someone with Sienna's level of technical skill, but his ego wouldn't let him make the smart choice. She rode his bridge like a wave, smooth and fluid, and transitioned seamlessly to his back. Her legs sank hooks, one inside his left thigh, one inside his right, controlling his hips so he couldn't buck or roll. Her arms slid under his chin into rear naked choke position, her right forearm across his throat, her left hand gripping her own right bicep to lock the structure. She held it there without squeezing, without applying pressure. Just positioning. The threat was implicit and absolute. One good squeeze and blood flow to his brain would stop. He'd have maybe 8 seconds before unconsciousness. She had complete control, and everyone watching understood it. Command Sergeant Major Thorne stepped forward, ready to call the match. Sienna released before that became necessary. She rolled away, came to her feet, and reset to neutral position. Professional. Controlled. Giving Brennan a chance to recover and reconsider. Brennan remained on his hands and knees for a moment, breathing hard. For the first time since this confrontation began, real doubt appeared in his eyes. The easy victory had become a struggle. The small woman who should have been helpless was systematically dismantling his certainty. The pattern repeated for the next 2.5 minutes. 3 men attacking with increasing desperation, using their size and strength and numerical advantage, trying every technique they knew. And Sienna flowing through them like water through rocks, always a half step ahead of where they thought she'd be, reading their intentions before they fully formed, exploiting every mistake with precision that looked effortless. There were no spinning kicks, no dramatic throws, nothing designed for show. Every movement had purpose. Every technique was fundamental. Every transition was efficient. It was the difference between someone who'd learned combatives from a curriculum and someone who'd been trained by people who'd used these skills to stay alive in places where mistakes meant death. At the 3.5-minute mark, injuries were accumulating. Drake had a bloody nose from an accidental elbow strike during a scramble for position, blood running down his face and dripping onto his tan shirt. Reeves was favoring his ribs where he'd landed poorly, trying to escape from a mounted position, each breath, visible effort. Brennan was limping slightly on his left ankle from a swept takedown, and his right shoulder was burning from that old Ranger School rotator cuff injury making itself known. What the spectators couldn't see, what only Sienna herself knew, was that she'd identified Brennan's shoulder injury during the first week of classes. She'd watched him favor it, seen him wince when weight went through it wrong, cataloged it as a weakness she could exploit. And every time she could have attacked that shoulder, could have applied pressure to the injury, and ended this quickly, she'd deliberately chosen a different technique instead. Not mercy, professional assessment. She was proving she was better without taking advantage of his vulnerability. She was demonstrating superiority through pure technical skill rather than exploitation of weakness. That distinction mattered. At the 4-minute mark, Cade Brennan's control finally shattered. 4 minutes of systematic domination. 4 minutes of watching everything he believed about size and strength and gender prove insufficient against someone who simply knew, more, moved better, understood combat at a deeper level. 4 minutes of his ego taking damage, it couldn't absorb his worldview collapsing under the weight of reality. He abandoned technique entirely. Pure aggression took over, that red haze that happens when a fighter stops thinking and starts reacting. He rushed in with no setup, no strategy, just violence. He drove Sienna backward and down, using every pound of his 235 to force her to the ground. He locked a guillotine choke around her neck, that standing headlock that can cut off blood flow quickly if applied correctly. And he cranked it. Not progressive resistance, not controlled technique, but maximum force. Trying to make her submit through pain and pressure, trying to force her unconscious, trying to prove his point through domination that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with ego. Sienna tapped. 3 clear strikes on his arm, the universal signal to release the submission. Her hand hit his forearm hard enough to hear, hard enough that there could be no confusion about what she was doing. He squeezed harder, twisting, applying more pressure, trying to force her unconscious. Thorne's voice cut across the training area like a rifle shot. Brennan, release now, that's a direct order. Brennan didn't hear him, or didn't care. The red haze had taken over, completely reducing everything to the need to win, to dominate, to prove he was stronger. His forearm pressed against Sienna's throat, cutting off blood flow to her brain. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Sienna's survival instincts drilled into her through 1,000 hours of training, through Hell Week and combat deployments, and that IED in Yemen activated without conscious thought. This wasn't training anymore. This was a threat, real and immediate, from someone who'd lost control. She responded accordingly. Her right leg hooked behind Brennan's left leg. Her hips bridged explosively upward, generating force from her core, from her legs, from every muscle in her body working in perfect coordination. She used his overcommitment against him, that fundamental principle, appearing again, and reversed their positions in a movement so fast the spectators barely tracked it. She transitioned immediately to an arm triangle choke, using her right arm and Brennan's own left shoulder to create the compression that would cut off blood flow to his brain through the carotid arteries. She locked it tight, squeezed with precision and control, applying exactly enough pressure to make her point absolutely clear. Brennan tapped. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Desperate panic, tapping against her arm, against the mat, against anything his hand could reach. The kind of frantic submission that came from genuine fear, from feeling what it meant to be helpless, to have another person hold your life in their hands. Sienna held the choke for 2 extra seconds, not long enough to cause real damage, not long enough to make him lose consciousness, but long enough to send an unmistakable message. You didn't release me when I tapped. I'm choosing to release you. Remember this feeling. Remember what it means to be helpless. Remember that I gave you mercy you didn't give me. Then she released, rolled away, and came to her feet. Blood marked her lower lip where it had split during the exchange. Bruises were forming on her neck, visible, even in the afternoon sun, dark marks that would last for days. Her PT shirt was torn at the shoulder, but her face held no expression at all. Not anger, not satisfaction, not triumph. Just professional calm, the expression of someone who'd done a job and done it correctly. Brennan remained on his hands and knees, coughing violently, one hand at his throat, trying to draw a full breath. His face had gone from red to pale, the color of someone who'd just experienced real fear, who'd felt what it meant to have another person hold their life in their hands and choose to let them live. For the first time since this whole situation began, Cade Brennan understood what he'd actually challenged. Not a diversity hire, not someone who didn't meet standards, but a weapon forged through training. He couldn't imagine tested in combat. He'd never experienced carrying skills that made his Ranger qualification look like a participation trophy. The realization showed on his face, visible to everyone watching, not just defeat, understanding. That's when the voice cut across the training area, loud and commanding, stopping everyone mid-breath. "Command Sergeant Major Thorne, hold that formation." Vice Admiral Marshall Blackstone strode through the gate with his aide and a JAG officer flanking him. Every soldier in the area snapped to attention so fast it looked choreographed. Blackstone was 68 years old, 3 stars on his collar even in retirement, and he carried himself with the authority of someone who'd spent decades in command of the most dangerous warriors America had ever produced. He took his time crossing to the ring, his boots crunching on the red Georgia clay, letting the silence build. When he reached the edge of the training pit, he surveyed the scene with the expression of someone who had seen exactly what he expected to see and was now deciding what to do about it. "Take a knee," he said. His voice wasn't loud, didn't need to be. It carried absolute authority, the kind that came from 30-plus years of commanding men in the worst places on earth. Everyone complied immediately. Brennan, Drake, and Reeves knelt where they stood, their faces showing varying degrees of confusion and fear. The spectators in the bleachers remained seated, but went absolutely still, that particular military stillness, and that meant something important was happening, and nobody wanted to miss it. Sienna took a knee with the others, though Blackstone's eyes tracked to her specifically for just a moment. Some unspoken acknowledgement passed between them, a recognition that transcended rank and circumstance. Thorne remained standing, as was his right as the senior NCO present, but even he looked uncomfortable with what was coming. He'd been around long enough to recognize career-ending moments when he saw them, and this had all the hallmarks. Blackstone clasped his hands behind his back and began speaking in a tone that combined disappointment, calculation, and something harder to define. "I've been observing this course for 72 hours, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the training pit. "I received a call from Master Chief Thaddeus Bridger, SEAL Team 2 Cold War and Desert Storm veteran. He told me his goddaughter, a former SEAL Hell Week completion 2017 combat veteran, was facing institutional resistance at this installation." The crowd shifted. People who'd thought they were watching a training evolution suddenly realized they were witnessing something much larger. "So I reviewed her service record," Blackstone continued. "I observed multiple training sessions. I consulted with subject matter experts who've trained personnel for missions I still cannot discuss in this setting." He paused, let that information settle like dust after an explosion. "Today's demonstration was particularly educational. I watched 3 soldiers attempt to overwhelm one opponent using numerical superiority, significant size advantage, and coordinated tactics." His eyes moved deliberately to Brennan, then Drake, then Reeves. "I watched them fail comprehensively. And then I watched one of those soldiers lose control, ignore the safety rules, and attempt to injure his training partner after she had tapped in submission." The words fell like hammer blows. Brennan's face had gone from pale to ashen. He understood now that this wasn't just about a training match. This was about his career, his future, everything he'd worked for. Blackstone turned to face the full formation, his voice carrying authority accumulated over decades. "How many of you know what it takes to become a Navy SEAL?" Silence, confused looks, scattered responses. Most had vague awareness, knowledge gleaned from movies and reputation, but nothing concrete. "Basic underwater demolition SEAL training," Blackstone explained. 6 months of training that is arguably the most difficult in the world. Particularly Hell Week, 5.5 days, 4 hours of total sleep, constant exposure to cold water, pushed beyond what you think is humanly possible to endure. He let that sink in. Some of the soldiers were leaning forward now, caught by the specificity, by the details that made this real, rather than abstract. Class 352, January 2017. 197 candidates started. By the end of Hell Week 9 remained. His voice got quieter, which somehow made it more intense. One of those 9 was 21-year-old Sienna Vaughn, the first woman in SEAL history to complete Hell Week. She finished 5th overall out of the original 197. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Heads turned to look at Sienna, really seeing her for the first time. Not as a small woman who didn't belong, but as someone who'd accomplished something most of them couldn't imagine. She earned her trident in June 2017, Blackstone continued, deployed to Afghanistan in 2018, Iraq 2019 through 20, Syria 2020 through 21, Yemen 2021 through 22. Her combat record includes 27 confirmed kills, 0 civilian casualties, multiple commendations. SEAL Team 7 regarded her as one of their most effective operators. The weight of those words settled over the formation like a physical presence. 27 confirmed kills. Real people, real enemies, real combat. This wasn't a training instructor. This was a proven warrior. In March 2022, her element was hit by an IED in Yemen. Captain Vaughn sustained a compound fracture of her left leg. While wounded with 2 broken fingers on her right hand, she crawled to her teammate and applied medical aid. That teammate, Petty Officer First Class Morgan Sinclair, died from her injuries. Captain Vaughn was medically retired in September 2022 because she could no longer pass the physical standards required for SEAL operations. Blackstone's voice hardened. She transferred to the Army in January 2023 to become a combatives instructor. Not because she couldn't hack it, not because standards were lowered, but because she chose to continue serving in a different capacity. She's here to teach you skills learned through Hell Week, through multiple combat deployments, through training and experience most of you will never have. He turned back to Brennan. The silence was absolute now, every person present hanging on his words. So tell me, Staff Sergeant Brennan, after attempting to choke her unconscious when she tapped, after she could have broken your arm, dislocated your shoulder, or rendered you unconscious but chose not to, after she demonstrated technical superiority against 3 opponents simultaneously while showing more restraint and professionalism than you displayed. Long pause. Let the question hang in the air. Do you still think Navy SEALs are overrated? Do you still think she doesn't belong here? Do you still think her SEAL Combat Master certification was just paperwork to check a box? Brennan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound emerged. What could he possibly say? Every assumption he'd made had been systematically demolished. Every certainty had been proven wrong. He'd challenged someone who operated at a level he couldn't comprehend, and she'd made it look easy. Blackstone let the silence extend for another long moment, then continued. I commanded SEAL Team 6 for 4 years. I've seen thousands of candidates attempt to become SEALs. Most quit, some graduate, very few excel. His voice carried something that might have been pride. Captain Vaughn excelled. She didn't just survive Hell Week, she thrived. She didn't just deploy, she dominated in combat. She carries a trident scar on her shoulder from Hell Week hazing that crossed into assault. Most candidates would have quit after that. She earned it as a badge of honor. He paused, let that image sink in. She carries the dog tags of 2 teammates who died in combat. Lieutenant Jade Holloway killed in Afghanistan. Petty Officer First Class Morgan Sinclair killed in Yemen. Both of them told her before they died, don't let them forget what SEALs are made of. Today, Captain Vaughn remembered that promise. The crowd was absolutely silent now. Even the soldiers who'd been skeptical, who'd thought this was about diversity quotas and lowered standards, were beginning to understand they'd witnessed something they'd never see again. Blackstone's voice took on the formal tone of official action. I'm directing the following. Staff Sergeant Brennan, you will receive a General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand for training safety violations. You will be reassigned to Fort Cavazos, Texas, pending a formal investigation. You are removed from this course effective immediately. A Gomorrah was career-ending for an NCO. Brennan would never be promoted again, would likely be forced out at his current rank. The realization showed on his face, stark and final. 8 years of service, a Ranger Tab combat deployments, all of it undermined by 15 minutes of ego and poor judgment. Sergeant Drake, you will receive a written counseling statement and mandatory professional military education retraining. You will continue in this course under probationary status. Drake nodded mutely, understanding he'd been given a second chance he didn't deserve. His face showed shame more than relief. Specialist Reeves, you are removed from this course and returned to your basic unit. Given your age and the influence of senior personnel in this situation, you will not face additional disciplinary action. Learn from this. Reeves's relief was visible, mixed with something that looked like gratitude. He'd been the most uncomfortable with this from the beginning, the one who'd needed the least convincing that challenging Sienna was a mistake. Then Blackstone delivered the hammer blow nobody had expected. Command Sergeant Major Garrett Pierce will be retiring effective immediately. The nature of his involvement in orchestrating this situation has been documented and forwarded to appropriate authorities. Gasps from the crowd. Pierce was a senior NCO with 28 years of service, and he was being forced out because he'd manipulated events to humiliate a SEAL. Blackstone's influence had reached that high, move that fast, delivered consequences that severe. Finally, Blackstone looked at Sienna. Captain Vaughn, you will continue in this course. Based on your performance to date, I expect you will graduate at the top of your class. The United States Armed Forces needs instructors of your caliber. Carry on. Sienna came to her feet, stood at attention. Yes, sir. Blackstone addressed the full formation one last time. Everyone here witnessed something important today. You witnessed what happens when assumption meets reality, when prejudice meets performance. When someone who's been underestimated demonstrates exactly why that underestimation was a mistake. Captain Vaughn didn't just win a fight. She taught a lesson about competence having no gender requirement, about SEAL training working because it's built on fundamentals that transcend demographics, about what it means to earn your place through fire and blood and sacrifice. His voice dropped to almost a whisper, which made every word cut deeper. Remember this. She's a SEAL combat master. She earned that title through Hell Week, through combat, through losing friends and nearly losing her own life. Don't ever forget what that means. Dismissed. The formation broke slowly, soldiers moving away in clusters, talking in hushed voices, processing what they'd witnessed. The spectators in the bleachers filed out quietly, many of them looking back at Sienna with expressions ranging from respect to awe to something like fear. Sienna stood alone in the center of the ring for a moment, breathing slowly, her hand moving unconsciously to the trident scar on her shoulder. The bruises on her neck were darkening. Her split lip had stopped bleeding, but would be swollen tomorrow. Her left leg ached from the sustained activity, that nerve damage from Yemen making itself known. But she was still standing. She'd proven what needed proving. She'd kept her promise to Morgan and Jade. She'd honored Stone's training and her parents' legacy. She'd remembered what it meant to be a SEAL. 5 days later, the official actions came through exactly as Blackstone had promised. Brennan received his GOMOR and orders to Fort Cavazos. Pierce's retirement was processed with unusual speed, his name quietly removed from installation rosters. Drake and Reeves received their respective punishments and continued with noticeably different attitudes, quieter and more professional. Sienna continued the instructor course. She trained, she taught, she demonstrated techniques with the same precision she always had. But something had changed. Nobody made comments about diversity anymore. Nobody questioned whether she belonged. The dragon tattoo people had wondered about, the trident scar that told a story, became something soldiers noticed with respect rather than skepticism. Command Sergeant Major Thorne found her on the 7th day after the fight, standing near the training area, watching a new class run through basic grappling progressions. He approached carefully, hands visible, body language open. Captain, he said, I should have stopped it sooner. Should have protected you better. Should have recognized what Pierce was building toward and shut it down before it got to that point. Sienna looked at him with those calm eyes that had seen too much. You couldn't have stopped it, Master Chief. Not really. Even if you denied this specific match, the attitude would have remained. The belief that I don't belong, that standards were lowered, that my presence undermines the institution. This wasn't about one training evolution. It was about a lesson that multiple people needed to learn. Still, I should have done better. You approved it with safety measures. You were ready to intervene. You did your job. Sienna's voice softened slightly. And now everyone who watched learned something they wouldn't have learned any other way. Sometimes education requires demonstration. Thorne studied her face. Master Chief Bridges called me yesterday. Said to tell you he's proud. Said the teams are proud. Said you honored everyone who trained you. Sienna touched the trident scar through her shirt. That was always the plan. The following Monday, Sienna stood before a formation of 32 soldiers beginning their Level 4 combative certification. She didn't mention what had happened, didn't reference her background, didn't explain the trident scar that some of them had heard about. She simply demonstrated a technique, a basic hip throw from collar-tie position, broke it down into components, asked for volunteers to practice. Specialist Beckett Hayes stepped forward first, then a staff sergeant who'd been in the audience during the match, then two more, then another. Within minutes, the entire class was engaged, asking questions, taking notes, treating her exactly like what she was, an expert teaching her craft. After class, a young private approached. Female, maybe 20 years old, fresh from basic training. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "my recruiter told me women couldn't do what you did, that we'd never be as good as the men." She hesitated. "I watched the fight. I just wanted to say thank you for showing us it was possible." Sienna looked at her for a long moment, saw herself at that age standing at her parents' funeral stone offering to train her, wondering if she could ever be strong enough. "What's your name, Private?" "Keller, ma'am." Private Keller competence has no gender requirement. You earn your place through performance, not through permission. Remember that? "Yes, ma'am." As Keller walked away, Sienna touched the trident scar through her shirt. This was why she'd transferred to the Army. This was why she'd kept her promise to Morgan and Jade. The knowledge survived. The legacy continued. One soldier at a time. That evening, Sienna sat in her quarters and called Stone one final time. She told him everything: the fight, the intervention, Blackstone's speech, the aftermath. Stone listened without interrupting, the way he always had, giving her space to process through speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then his voice came through the phone, rough with emotion. "Your parents would be so proud, Sienna. Your father was a pilot, flew combat missions, understood what it meant to put your life on the line for your country. Your mother ran intelligence operations, knew what it meant to serve in places where your contributions would never be publicly recognized. They'd be beyond proud of what you've become. But I'm most proud," Stone continued. "Not because you won, because you taught. You showed them that competence transcends demographics. That SEAL training works because it's built on fundamentals, not gender. That warriors come in all forms." Brennan learned a hard lesson, but more importantly, everyone watching learned. The next woman who walks through Fort Moore's gates won't face the same resistance because of what you did. Sienna felt that tightness in her chest again, that mixture of grief and pride and purpose. "Stone, thank you for everything, for raising me after Mom and Dad died, for training me, for believing when the Navy brass said women couldn't be SEALs, for making me the warrior I am." Stone's voice broke slightly. "Your parents asked me to look after you if anything happened. I did more than that. I raised a SEAL who made them proud, made the teams proud, made me proud. Now continue the mission. Teach the next generation. Pass on what you learned. When you're my age, there'll be dozens of women warriors who learned from you like you learned from me. That's the real legacy. Not just what we accomplish, what we enable others to accomplish." After they hung up, Sienna stood in her quarters and opened the small wooden box. Two sets of dog tags, Jade Holloway and Morgan Sinclair. She touched each one, feeling the worn metal, remembering their voices. "For you, LT," she whispered. "I kept the promise. For you, Morg, I didn't let them forget." Then she touched the trident scar on her shoulder, traced the raised tissue with her fingertips. 7 years old now, faded but permanent, a reminder of what she'd survived and what she'd earned. "For everyone who doubted," she said to the empty room, "you learned." Her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number, encrypted sender. "8 sisters watching. We saw what you did. Former Spec Axe sisters proud. Denver next month. Time to discuss future of female operators." Frost, Sienna recognized the protocol. Colonel Diana Frost, her handler from the classified program, the 16 months that had been redacted from her official record. The program that had taken SEAL-trained women and pushed them even further into operations that would never be acknowledged. She typed her response, "I'll be there, Reaper." Set the phone down, looked at the trident scar one last time. Tomorrow she would teach. Tomorrow she would train the next class of soldiers, passing on the knowledge that Stone and Flint and Doc and Ice had given her. Tomorrow, the work would continue. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She'd proven what needed proving. She'd taught the lesson that needed teaching. She'd honored the promises she'd made to the dead and the living alike. She was a SEAL combat master, and now everyone knew exactly what that meant. The only easy day was yesterday. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to pass on what she'd learned in places that officially didn't exist, doing things that couldn't be acknowledged at standards most people would never reach. But she was ready. She had always been ready, and she always would be. The dragon had shown its teeth, and no one would forget.